Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today with Paula Deitz, editor of the Hudson Review. Thanks so much for joining us today, Paula.
I'm delighted, really delighted to be here. Yes.
And thanks everyone for coming out. As always, any questions, just go ahead and type it into the chat and I will work the question into the conversation with Paula.
Terrific.
So let's jump right in. I know this is the 75th anniversary issue. That's such a huge accomplishment. Congratulations.
It's breathless. We've just had a wonderful time doing it too. It's been a very exciting issue.
That's great. So tell us, can you take us back to the origin of the magazine? Tell us when it was founded.
I'd be delighted.
Yes.
It all goes back to Princeton University. In 1939, Princeton English department hired the Southern poet Alan Tate to do a creative writing class. It wasn't popular with all the really academic professors, but there it was. And they wanted to be certain it was a success. So they kind of drafted boys from various schools, private and public, who were already writing poetry. And my late husband, Frederick Morgan, was at St. Paul's School at that time, and he was writing poetry. And they put together this class. They all loved working with Alan Tate. He came in kind of hungover most of the time, but they just got a lot out of it. And he and another classmate named Joe Bennett, and I just found out we had a big celebration the other night, and Joe Bennett's nephew came from Pittsburgh and said that he was actually the valedictorian of that class of 43 at Princeton, which I had never known, which is very interesting. Anyway, the two boys got together and they became the editors of the Princeton literary magazine called the Nassau Lit. And they were just terrific editors, and they used to bring showgirls down from New York to mix on the campus to get subscriptions and all. They were really hilarious, two working together. And Thomas Mann was living in Princeton then, had left Germany, and he was in the Nassau Lit at that time. Anyway, this class, the class of 43, was not allowed to stay until May or June graduation because they all had to go in the armed forces, and they were graduated in January with the trains on the tracks right in Princeton. And Alan Tate's farewell to them was, if you boys live and get back to New York, you should begin your own magazine. And that is the origin of the Hudson Review. Along the way, they picked up William Arrowsmith, the translator, who was a little younger than they were at Princeton. And I think he was in the Army and then went back to Princeton. And so the three of them got together, and it was just done out of Fred Morgan's father had a factory in New York, and they used the trustees' room and they began it. And they were very lucky. They got, really interesting people right away. Of course, Merwin, W.S. Merwin, was still a student at Princeton, but he was already in the magazine in those earlier years. Wow. And they decided they wanted it to be a magazine of literature and the arts, and we still, cover the arts, today in a whole section. So, and I guess the original idea, they had some very well-known writers right away, but I think beside that, I think they always had the idea of getting new writers. And really, if you look at the notes and contributors, we have a little asterisk down at the bottom, and it says asterisk marks new writers, and we never run an issue without a new writer. We have about 15% new writers. I mean, that means writers making their first appearance in the magazine a year. Mm-hmm. So that's really how it began. And then Joe Bennett did it with Fred Morgan for a while. He then went on to work on Wall Street and eventually went to live abroad. So Frederick Morgan was really the sole editor who continued the magazine. Yeah.
That's incredible. So when you look back over the history of the magazine, do you feel like you have this, it's an incredible historical record. So you're sort of like seeing how the country has changed, how writers have changed. Like, do you view the journal as sort of like this?
Well, you change with every generation.
Yeah.
Because really we're lucky because we've never gone after famous writers. In other words, if somebody comes to us or we meet somebody and say, what are you working on? And they send it to us, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But I think we've been very lucky because we've been open to the writers. And therefore, I mean, there was a time, for example, that the Hudson Review was very active in the whole movement called New Criticism, which, you know, we're really not in it today. So it kind of, somebody told me when they look at the Hudson Review that it kind of flips every 10 years, depending on who the writers are. And it was very interesting because we gave a big party on our 50th anniversary. And we did just last Friday night for the 75th anniversary. And it was all new writers. And I was trying to think who was there now who was, you know, there may be a few who were there from the 50th anniversary time. But and I looked around and I said, you know, these people, many of them had never met Frederick Morgan. And we did have a wonderful video. The whole program is mostly done in video, except we had Andrew Motion, the former poet laureate of England, who was in the issue. He read his poems live, but everybody else was on video. And we had a wonderful video of Fred Morgan reading his poems. And he'd read 4 poems at the end so that people could see Frederick Morgan. It was very moving to do that. Yeah. But I think mainly it's because we're so open and which is also, you're always a little bit worried, like, do we have something for the autumn issue yet? I mean, you're just waiting for things to come in. So it's in ways it's fun, but it's also a harder job. Yeah. Because you're just hoping that essay will come in, because we need 2 essays in the issue. And, you know, and that's why you're not always looking back. You're just always, you know, making the next issue. So it's fun that way.
That's really heartening to hear, because this is something we talk about at Lit Mag News quite a bit. And I think there's a perception with the more established and very prestigious magazines that it's like an insider club. And you just can't get in there.
Might be easier if we were, but we're not.
So it sounds like you take a lot of work through, you know, the transom, through the slush pile.
Everything, you know, I mean, the essay that's going to go in the summer issue just came in about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
And because I was in the reading period for I'm the one who does the nonfiction reading period, and it starts January 1st to March 31st. And this actually came in March, and I actually knew who the writer was, but it was just sent in the normal. I mean, I know a lot of the writers who sent essays at that time, but and I jumped on it. And our system is that we do have a group of advisory editors, because I'm not an expert. For example, I'm not an expert in everything on Robert Frost. So something comes in Robert Frost, I know exactly who to send to, and he'll say, oh, that's been said before. Don't worry, you can't take that because somebody, you know, or this is really fresh. This is very, very interesting new point of view. And so I do take those opinions in account, but I always make the final decision. And that makes life easier. Sometimes I'll make the wrong decision. I mean, I know when Fred Morgan turned it over to me, he said, don't worry, you'll make wrong decisions. You know, things will happen. I mean, you'll reject something and years later you'll think about it. Maybe I made the wrong choice. But, you know, that goes with the territory. Right.
Sure. So I see we have some questions coming in, but just quickly, can you give us some insight into why you jumped on that particular piece? What qualities?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. You know, I'm always, during this period, one of the things I always want to write back to the people is, did you read the Hudson Review? I mean, we're online. Not everything's online, but there's always enough online. Did you look at the Hudson Review before you thought about sending this essay? And I think most of them don't. And so you'll get a lot of things about my summer vacation, or, you know, which is nicely done, but it's not for us. This essay by Carl Kirschway, who is a poet, actually, he's doing a whole book in memory of an uncle who died in the Pacific during World War II. He was a pilot.
What are you doing?
I'm sorry, I thought I heard something coming out. Either he was shot down by the Japanese, or it was friendly fire. They don't know which, but he went down and they never found him, never found the plane. And he is doing a series of essays in relation to literature, and ours was in relation to The Tempest, and has as one of the main poets in it all the verses of Ariel, and the idea of the the ship going under and everything having to do with the Tempest. And then he went into other poets who had talked about underwater, Adrian Rich, and he had all kinds of poets. And so he took this and he interwove it with this memory. He never knew his uncle, who was too young, but it's just haunted his whole life. And there was a way that he took something that was a very family kind of event, but he wove it through literature. And I just thought he did it very, very well. We made, in this instance, we accepted it and did send some editorial suggestions, because when I get it back from the advisory editors, oftentimes they'll say this sentence could have gone here or so forth. At that point, if we've accepted it, we're fingers crossed he'll make this, he'll take the suggestions, but it's not absolutely required. But generally I find that they may take all but maybe one or something of that kind. I find that writers, I'm a journalist myself, which is a whole other career, and I'm always welcome to that's some little suggestion that will refine your language, to make what I call clarity, So he took it, and we're thrilled. I gather in all the other journals, and others have been accepted, that he's running a lot of photographs, and he said no photographs. It's all in the imagination, especially with the Tempest. So that there's an example, absolutely. Yeah,
that's great. And we just have a question about submissions. It looks like you accept only hard copy submissions.
No, fiction is online. We get 1,500 a year, and we only publish at the very top 8. So it's very stiff. Poetry is done by mail with a self-addressed stamped envelope, except we just had our first, for the 75th anniversary, we initiated the first Frederick Morgan poetry contest, and that was online, but that's now closed. The question is, after we go through this, the question is whether next year we would do it online or not. We haven't made that decision yet. We'll see how many we got, how many we could read. Generally, as I said, we get about 1,500 fiction, and we get about 200 poetry a year. So it's much less. And with the essays, only about 100. And they have different reading periods. So I mentioned the reading period for nonfiction is January 1st to March 31st. And I actually have it in front of me. A poetry is from April 1st to June 30th. And then fiction is September 1st to the end of November. And we used to do it all year round, but with only 4 people in house, we couldn't get it all done in time, right? We'd fall behind. So, yeah.
So can you take us through your editorial process? Do you have readers that screen the work and then pass it on to you, and then you send it to the advisory board, or how does
we do it all in house. I'm the nonfiction person, so I'm the first reader, and from me they go to the advisory editors. We have two people in house who do fiction, and oftentimes we get interns to do it as well. When we see it's building up, because we don't want to have to take forever to do it. And once they make their opinions, it goes directly. Now I hear about what's going, and what I usually do is I read it at the same time that the advisory editors are reading it. And or if there's a question, sometime, should this go to an advisory editor, or when it's really on the fence, then I'll make that decision. But our fiction readers are really good, and when you go through that much, it's maybe it's not apropos, but since I did do some teaching at Columbia, you always know when you have the A paper. The A paper just shines. Maybe a B plus, maybe you'll see a B plus. So when you have a lot of experience reading, we find that we're more on the generous side than not, and we like to hear other people's opinions of it. Sure. So that's what happens, and then it comes back with their opinions. Sometimes it's 3 negative opinions, and I maybe at that point, won't bother even reading it. But that's how it goes, right? Same with poetry and fiction. And as I said, I'm the one who does all the nonfiction.
And question, how many poetry readers are there?
We have one poetry reader because we have fewer poetry. Yeah, my one poetry, and he himself is well versed in it, studied it, works on it himself. He's an excellent reader. And any questions, like, the point is, we're only 4 people. Any questions that come up, they come right to me. And for example, when we send them out, of course, there are always many repeats, but every time we send it out, there are always a few new poets whenever we send it out to the advisory editors, because we like that competition of the new writer. I mean, we just want to get that asterisk all over the notes of contributors, you know. Right. And it's not just poets that are new. I mean, we're always looking for new reviewers. People don't think of us. To review in the Hudson Review, we're always looking to expand them. We have a regular group of reviewers whom we go to, you know, for every issue. But for example, well, I should put in here, we have a very big Writers in the School program since the year 2000. Underserved high schools in New York City and in Newark, New Jersey, in their English classes, the teacher will pick something from the Hudson Review, a short story, memoir, or poems, and the class reads them, studies them in class, and then we bring in the writer. It's a very simple, direct, and wonderful program. And anyway, I forgot what the question was, but I was mentioning about this. What is the question that you're asking?
I was about poetry readers.
Right. Anyway, I'll come back to that, but I just wanted to get that in. I forgot the point I was
That's great. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think more lit mags should actually do something like that, like outreach in the schools. That sounds like a great program.
It is amazing. It's an amazing program. Poetry goes very well. Maybe that's what I was going to tell you. In the English language learner schools, which are mostly immigrants, bright kids who just learning English for the first time, and they like getting a poem. One of our poets, Leanne Strauss, does a marvelous job because she puts it up on the smart screen, you know, the smart screen beforehand, and then she always asks, please list the words that you don't know, and then they go through and she gives them the meaning, and then we go back and we read the poem. So it's very exciting to do it that way, right?
So shifting to the fiction, I'm remembering now in the 2017 Best American Short Stories, there was a story by Joseph Epstein.
Yes.
My Brother Eli. Do you remember? This was from the Hudson Review.
Yes, I know, but I published it so many times. What was the title of it?
My Brother Eli.
Oh, yes, right.
I'm just remembering it now. And it was such a great story.
It's the funniest stories. Yes.
It's a very funny story. And I wanted to ask if that was a typical, like if you see that as sort of embodying the fiction style that you seek in work.
No, Joseph Epstein is sui generis. I mean, he has a style. And, you know, I never solicited from him. We published him many times. And I might say we also didn't accept him all the time, you know, but the ones we did were absolutely hilarious and funny, and always about Chicago, you know, where he is. But even his stories were just, I didn't solicit, they would just come in. You know, one reason why I don't like to solicit is there's an implication if you solicit something very directly that you have to accept it.
Yeah.
And I once, very early on when I was an editor, I did solicit something, I mean, from somebody who was really important. And what was sent to us was really not publishable. Yeah. And that ended that friendship. That was done. So I decided from that point on that I would never solicit again. Sometimes, well, for example, for the anniversary review just now, I wanted very special things, and I went to several writers and I asked them, what are you working on? That's my question, is what are you working on? And I went to Alicia Stallings, A.E. Stallings, the poet, who's in Athens, thinking she might have poems. And she wrote back, I'm working on something that's too long for a magazine and too short for a book. Well, it sounded just right to me because we always do a sort of book length issue for the anniversary. And that has now become such a hit. It is the entire history of the Elgin marbles, from the Parthenon that are now in the British Museum. It's about all the artists and writers that it influenced, from Byron to James Merrill. It's about the whole story of the excavation and the unpleasantness of it, really, and about the debate between the British Museum and Greece. Now it's over 100 pages.
Wow.
And it's and actually, if you see the issue, that's why we have the Parthenon is on the cover, the Parthenon on the cover. And so, I was really thrilled. But if she told me something that didn't sound right, I would say, well, that's interesting, but I grabbed it when I heard what it was going to be about. And then I happened to be in Paris over the Christmas vacation, and I met with Richard Pavir and Larissa Volokhonsky. I don't know whether you know this couple. They are the great Russian translators. And, they've done Anna Karenina and War and Peace. They've done everything, really. And I asked them what they were working on, and they said that they were working on Ludmila Yuliskaya, a current Russian writer who actually is living, I always have to say that, living in exile, because of Putin. She always wants me to say that when I talk about her. And she wrote these wonderful kind of supernatural stories, which the Pavirs they weren't even finished translating them. I said, we can't get them to you tonight. Can give us a few weeks to finish them? And then they said, well, we had sent one to the New Yorker. Well, we always know you start with the New Yorker and then you come to the Hudson. That's all right. I'm used to it. So that her first story that they translated went to the New Yorker, but I gather it was very well received. And I picked actually 4 of them. So I got a good lot of it. But that's as far as I go. I'm always listening, and I think that's what you have to do. And sometimes people say, "Where do you get your things?" And I say, sometimes dinner parties are the best place, because you hear what people are writing. You hear people talking about what they're doing, and then I can always write them the next day and said, "Will you let me see it?" And that's as far as I will go. Actually soliciting it, and I feel no compunction now, rejecting something. That way. I still lose friends. Get bad reviews. I mean, sometimes we publish poets, and then the book won't get a good review. But there's nothing I can do about that. I don't instruct my reviewers what to do. So you just take it with the territory.
Sure.
Yeah.
And in terms of the kind of fiction that you're looking for, because you mentioned the speculative works, and then I think of like Joseph Epstein's story is very funny, but it was sort of more conventional, like character, sort of a nice arc. Beginning.
Exactly. No, it is.
Is that the kind of thing that generally the magazine prefers, or would you say you're open to like experimental?
All I'm looking for, there are 3 things I'm looking for: originality, clarity, and a kind of elegance of style. I mean, really good style. And as an aside, though, you can't always ask for it, good grammar.
that seems
I cannot tell you. I mean, my I have a wonderful managing editor, Ron Corey. He's been here for 42 years, and we go over those commas together. And even my staff writers, like my theater critic, I mean, he gets mixed up between compound and declare. I mean, he just doesn't know where the commas go. And so we're always with commas. It's good to have people who have some understanding of grammar. And in America, it's much better. I must say that British authors forget it. I mean, I don't think there's any rhyme or reason for any kind of commas in England. But anyway, Americans are really much better. But having some sense of grammar, helps. But we're just totally open. It can be something very eccentric. It can be, as you say, the Joe Epstein, a very conventional story. But it just has to be really well written and has to be kind of excellent.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we do. And everything we do seems to differ very much, one story from another. Yeah.
Do you work with the writers to develop the stories? If you feel like maybe you have a new writer and the piece is almost there and it just needs maybe 1 or 2 rounds of revision, how much revision will you take on?
We will send it, we will, yes, we have a story in the house now, and I'm not sure it's going to make it even with the second one. But she's really onto something terrific. I'm not going to give names or anything. And we returned it to her with about 3 or 4 suggestions, and she took them, but she still isn't getting the pace correctly. And we're all feeling bad about it because she's really quite good, and we don't want to keep asking her to do. We're not sure she can do it. That's the problem around. So we will send it back. We will not rewrite. We do not rewrite in the Hudson Review. We'll make suggestions, and we'll always say we'll be happy to give it another read. And then, as I said, when something is good enough to accept it, we'll send it back with maybe even like 15 suggestions of various wording, or whether a paragraph should go before another or something like that. And then usually when it's been accepted, we find they're very receptive about making those changes in that way. But we never take something apart and rewrite it. The writer has to do it in the long run, I feel, right?
And you mentioned earlier the magazine was founded out of Princeton, but now today it's not affiliated with.
No, and it never had an affiliation. It was just that it was Princeton. It was Princeton. It was just Princeton students. There were 3 Princeton alumni, and actually, both Ron Corey and I are Columbia people. And, we keep making that point to Columbia Magazine that we're now Ron went to Columbia College, and I did my graduate work at Columbia. So and now Catherine Seeger, my new assistant editor, did her MFA at Columbia. So we're very Columbia right now. Princeton is the recipient of our archives. In 2006, they purchased our entire archive, and every 10 years, we're going to be due in a couple of years to give them let them purchase more. We don't do it now because everything's email, but and in some ways we miss it. We couldn't keep them in our office anymore, but every once in a while I have to go down to Princeton and look things up. But at least because it had this connection with them in the beginning, they wanted to purchase them. And they have actually Alan Tate's papers and other papers that kind of go with it. Charles Scribner, whose family had the publishing company, they have his papers. And Charles Scribner and Frederick Morgan were roommates all the way through prep school and at Princeton. So they liked that connection that they had. Right.
So is the Hudson Review totally independent? And if so, how do you
totally, and that we love. We've never been associated, we're not associated with any university or foundation, which means we have to do a lot of fundraising, because we don't have, but we have independence. I mean, what more do you want? There's nobody standing over us. And we have a wonderful, our fundraising arm is called the Friends of the Hudson Review. And we have really, really, loyal donors, and some family foundations. For example, there's the Lanny and Ethel Foundation supports the entire Writers in the School program. And we have another member, because part of the Writers in the School program is we also take twice a year, we'll take a class to the Metropolitan Opera dress rehearsal in the morning. They do one dress rehearsal, and we do that. And for example, this coming Friday, we're taking the senior class from the Young Women's Leadership School in Harlem to the Metropolitan Museum to see an exhibition with our art critic. So they come with our art critic, and before the opera, they get an orientation at the school from our music critic. And so, and these are mostly students who've never been to the opera or to a museum. And then after that, they'll come back, So
Yeah, that's really interesting, because something else that we talk about at LitMag News a lot is how magazines seem to rely on submission fees from writers to sustain the
Right.
magazine. But it's nice to hear that there are alternatives. And it sounds like with the Hudson Review, one of those alternatives is sort of establishing more outreach programs that make the magazine eligible for grants and donations. And
Exactly. No, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
yeah.
Everyone loves the Writers in the School program, I can tell you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and then it sort of it builds ties with the community, and then it also, brings in some grant
And
funding.
it's,
Yeah.
yes, I mean, I might tell you, we haven't gotten anything from NEA for years, but there are other places that they now, when you do an application, they want to know what your community involvement is. And for
Right,
us, it's a no-brainer,
right.
you see. I mean, we're addressing, in other words, we can't make this full time because, we're editing a magazine, but we must get to at least 700 students a year, I
Mm-hmm.
would say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's 700 students who will remember us.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
great.
then they also get free subscriptions for a year to the Hudson Review, which will be fine online.
What do
Right.
you think? I mean, when I think of the Hudson Review, I think prestige right away.
I mean, I'm glad you think of it. We're just we'd be doing it. When people say to me, I say, well, that's great.
Yeah.
It's very hard for us to get publicity. I mean, this is so nice that you're doing it. I was thrilled that you came to us. I mean, I probably shouldn't even say this in public, but there are other magazines I won't name that when there's an editor who's been there 2 years and is leaving it, it's a big article in the New York Times.
Right.
Somebody's just been there for 2 years or something. But to a magazine that's gone 75 years and has only had 2 editors, that's like not news at all.
Right.
It's so strange. But anyway, it would be, I mean, it's not that you're out for the publicity, it's just it does help to get subscriptions.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
We're happy
Maybe
about
every
that.
editor feels like there's another tier they could be aspiring to. But I definitely think like within the LitMag ecosystem, I think of Hudson Review as, one of the
Well,
absolutely
thank
top
you.
tier.
Well, tell
I was
everybody when we get off. Guys, this is terrific.
I
But
was going to
I
ask,
mean, when I
like,
think of a typical day, we just come in and work.
yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know if you can answer this then, but I was going to ask, like, what do you think accounts for the magazine's prestige? But maybe you don't think of it in
Well,
those terms.
there's one thing I might say. I think agents and publishers watch us
Yeah.
because when we publish a really great story, or maybe two stories by the same one, we will probably never hear from that person again because they get an agent. And they get a publisher, and then next they have a collection of short stories. And I'm thrilled. I mean, we stay in touch with these people, but I think the agents and publishers watch us. So I think our authors, once they're in the Hudson Review, I think they get books. And I think that's very exciting. And that's exciting for us.
Yeah.
I mean, we see them, coming back to us where, I know my managing editor will bring the book and say, oh, here's so-and-so's book, and we're listed. You can see some of the poems came from us, but you can see that he got into other magazines. So I think it may be for writers a kind of entry into the publishing world. And that's very satisfactory for us, And as I said, there are always other new writers. So, if we don't get another short story, it sometimes works in reverse, however. Some writers who there's a Times writer who had an essay which he sent to us, and I asked him to come in to see me. And I said, do you mind asking you why you sent that to us? You could have probably gotten that in the magazine section of the Times. He said, well, actually, my wife subscribes to the Hudson Review, and she said it was more like the Hudson Review. And he's become, somebody who's come in not often, but maybe every 2 years. So he'll come in now. Yeah, which is very good. Right.
So another question relatedly, what accounts for the magazine's longevity? Because so many lit mags come and go. We see them, they start up and then 2 years later they go under for whatever reason, but 75 years, it's such an accomplishment.
I know, it seems incredible to us as well.
Yeah.
Frederick Morgan became, in addition, becoming the editor and being the full-time editor, had done poetry in high school, but he then kind of picked it up at a later age. He was in his late 40s when he began writing, and he did 9 books altogether. And actually, I just edited last year his final book that Red Hen published, called Epilogue, because I found 25 poems of his, or 23 poems that had never been in a book. But when he got to 50 years, so in 1998, when we gave the big 50th anniversary party, first I should tell everybody, because you don't know the other part of the story, but I married Frederick Morgan. It's like, I began working at the Hudson Review, and it's like that great line in Jane Eyre, I married him. Reader, I married him. So we did it, once we were married, we did it together, and we were co-editors. And in 1998, he said, okay, 50 years is long enough for anybody to do any one thing. And he was much, much older than I was. And he said, I'd like to have the time to write another book of poems. And he did, a really outstanding book. And he said, either we can end it, and it can be like a 20th century, like the Dial, or, one of the other magazines that was in the 20th century. He said, and because I was doing freelance journalism, and I was doing a lot for the New York Times, and he said, and you could just continue your writing. You could just do your writing, and that's it. He said, but you could continue as the editor. He said, but I'd like you to take 6 months to think about it, because really think about it, what you want to do. And I don't know whether any of you have ever read Middlemarch. There's a wonderful scene when Casaubon asked Dorothea, his wife, if she will continue his work. They're sitting on a bench in a park. I can see somebody saying yes, yes, right? And she goes off to think about it. And when she comes back, he's dead. And so she doesn't have to make the decision. But anyway, after 6 months, I said, there's no way I could leave the writers the fun of being in the office every day. And it's stimulation. And thank goodness for the pandemic, only I don't say this to too many people, but probably a lot of people out there. I had a great pandemic because I was able to do the Hudson Review and write a book. It was my second book, but I just, so I've been able to do my writing at the same time, essentially. And so from 1998 on, I was the editor. I would not let Frederick Morgan off on reading some final manuscripts, and he was, great as long as he lived. He passed away in 2004. But right until the last, we were, even in the hospital, I remember we were making decisions on manuscripts together. Yeah, so David Mason, our writer, always knows that was his last, that was the last manuscript that he had sent in, that we made a decision on together.
Wow.
So then when I took it over, there I was, I just on my own, and I went in. I remember the day after the funeral, I went right back to work, and you learn on the job. There were some things, that he did that I learned how to do, and he was great at assigning reviews. It took me a while. Every time I assigned a review to somebody, they said, "Oh, I'm so glad you did that review. I'm teaching that in a course this time." And I think, "Oh my God, I did the right thing," So after a while, you learn, who does what. Right. But now I remember what I was going to tell you about the Writers in School program. One of my fiction writers, Louise Marburg, spoke at this young women's school in Harlem. They had read a short story of hers, and they were surprised that she didn't know, when she began writing, what the ending was going to be. She just kind of went along with the characters until she got there. And all kinds of things surprised them. And I said, I think you should do a book review of just short story books. You're saying things that very few reviewers will bring up. And we just happened to have a big pile of short story books to do. So she did. It was her first review for anybody ever. And so she's now paid her dues, and she's going to be, one of my new fiction reviewers. And I tell people, we get letters all the time about being reviewers, and it's very simple. You have to submit something, even 1,500 words, something that's very short. So if we don't take it, you haven't given it a lot of time in that way, and can get it published elsewhere. And it's always good to begin with a nonfiction book and to check it to make sure that we're not publishing it. And so people do send those in, and that's how we can find we like finding new reviewers, because we do 6 to 7 reviews in every issue. There's always the omnibus, as it were, poetry and fiction reviews, but there are always 5 or 6 other reviews, and we like getting new reviewers to do it. So that's how she became a reviewer. That's what I was going to tell you about Writers in the Skulls.
We have a bunch of questions here, and I'll get to all of them, but on the subject of reviews, there's a question: any advice, more information about what you look for in book reviews?
If you what
do you look for in book reviews? So can you
I can tell you that, I can tell you that, because it's got to have criticism in it. So for example, in a fiction review, we do need a little bit of the plot, but it can't be heavy on the plot without balancing it with fiction. And what made Louise so good is she had 3 things. She had good plot, enough plot. She had a kind of personal feeling about the book because she's a short story writer. She had some things to say. And then that branched out into some very good criticism. And I finally made up a kind of little how-to for my fiction writers, because over the years, it could be that they get too used to just doing the plot, and then it's just not criticism. So it has to be balanced in that way. And really with everything else, it's about what the book is about, but the criticism, we're writing criticism, and that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to think through. And that's the part that has to be, really clear and very original in their doing it.
That's nice to hear. Yeah, I think a lot of writers, there's a concern that writers today are hesitant to do serious criticism because the people that they're criticizing or writing about are their peers. So they don't want to come off as too critical of like a new short story collection.
We're very careful when somebody writes saying, "May I review so-and-so's book?" right away. You write back, "Well, it's somebody you know." A friend of yours. So we're very careful about that.
That's right.
No, you can't. I mean, that we get those all. I hate to say, we do get those all the time. So you have to be careful. Right.
And another question: how many nonfiction pieces are published per year?
All right, that's fun. So I like to have 2 essays. People are writing shorter essays now. So it could even be 3 essays in one issue. So that would make it 12. We have a column in the beginning, which contains 2 things. We like letters from abroad. Anyone traveling, but it's not just travel letters. It's about, for example, in London, I just got from one of my advisory editors just wrote in that he thought the letter from London in our current issue was the best one we'd ever published. It's by a professor at NYU, Larry Wolf, and his wife, Perry Class, who's a doctor and Times writer. And it's a terrific letter from London. But it's in a section we call comment. So comment also, if somebody's made a literary discovery or something of that nature, it goes perfectly in that column. So also, they're shorter. And that's something for people to think about, because it could be a very original short piece. So that it is an essay, but that would make it that we could do almost 4 essays in it. We do have, essentially, to give you how that magazine is shaped up, we have as it were, the comment column, 2 or 3 essays, 2 or 3 short stories, depending on their length. And again, they're writing, it used to be any short story was 23 pages and now maybe 16. So we like to have, more than one. About 26 pages of poems. Sometimes a poet will have 5 pages, sometimes 2, sometimes 1. But I like to have about 20 to 25 pages of poetry. We have about 50 pages of reviews. And then we have our arts review. We cover all the arts: music, dance, theater, film, and so forth. So, and every issue is 176 pages. So I'm always working and wondering, and as things are coming in, will I make it? And it's so interesting after all these years from assigning and working with people that when we get to that last stage, it's almost exactly 176 pages. So it just shows you if you have a lot of experience, you get a second feel for it, you know. Yes.
That's great. And do you accept work based on how it communicates with other work that you know you'll be accepting?
No, I don't. Themes will develop in a very interesting way. Sometime a poet will write in and say, I can't believe that you put my poem next to that essay. I take note.
Wow.
there may be a time that I'll just think things fit in better in that way. But in that case, I didn't at all. And I thought, oh, it's so nice that she's happy. I had no idea that she was thinking that, and it you know, did that. I have done themed issues, however. For our last anniversary, we did a literature in the environment. In 1970, the beginning of Earth Day, I did our first theme issue called Poetry and Ecology. And I've done a new writers issue where everybody in the issue was a new writer. I mean, that was the hard one, but I did it. So I like doing it. I've done a French issue where everything in the beginning was all French literature in translation. And actually, right at the time of the beginning of the pandemic, the spring 2020 issue was a British issue. And that was hard. We got all British poets, and we had to find them. And actually, the Spanish issue that we did, our offices for many, many years was in the Spanish Institute on Park Avenue. And it was just great because they knew a lot of writers. And I wrote to everyone I knew, Spanish professors at Columbia, all different kinds of people, giving me a list of writers we should have. And everyone had the writer Antonio Munoz Molina, who's a great novelist and essayist. And I wrote to him, and no, I couldn't write to him now that I remember. I had to write to his agent. I couldn't do anything with him. She wouldn't let me near him. Oh, wow. And I got a fantastic essay called Double Education about, he grew up as a peasant and he got a scholarship to go to university just at the time that Spain was emerging as a democracy. And it was all about the education of Spain and his education. It was a brilliant essay. And we had to send the proof to the agent to correct. And finally, when it was over, I wrote to her and I said, I would like to thank him directly. I will copy you. Just give me his. So she got the copy, and he wrote back right away and he said, when can we have coffee? Oh. And he has been in the Hudson Review ever since. I mean, it's thrilling. And he's just delivered. He was living in New York at that time. He now is back in Madrid. He's just been the artist in residence at the Prado for a couple of years. And he did 4 lectures, of which we've already published 2, and we have 1 more coming out. And we got immediate permission to do the first 2. And then they got worried because they were giving it to us for free. And so Antonio went to them and said, no, they're a nonprofit magazine. Let them have so we're going to do the other 2. And I hope eventually some publisher will pick it up and publish them as a book. And really maybe all the essays of his that we've done in English, they would make a great book. That's great. But that's it. So, you know, you pick up, I mean, he was, I think, one of the greatest writers we picked up along the way. Yeah.
We have sort of a related kind of logistical question. So yes. In your guidelines, you say that work published in the you want work that will not appear in a book in the near future.
Okay, so we don't publish anything. Yes, we have to have at least a 6-week lead time to any other publication of the work. We'd like to have more, but if somebody sometimes will accept a poem, maybe we've taken a little long to do it, they said, but I have a book coming out, but we don't publish any work that's been published before in English. In other words, all of Molina's works have been in Spanish someplace. But we do like a lead time. Yes, we only publish things as the first publisher. Right. So if the book is coming out in a year, it's okay, but just it's perfect. Oh yeah, I mean that's really perfect. Okay. But sometimes, we get caught because we've taken a little long, and they say, well, it's actually coming out of a book. And 6 weeks, I'll say. Right.
Okay.
Right. I don't like to be unkind. Right.
Seems fair.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
What would you like to see more of in submissions?
Better essays.
Mm.
Better essays. I reject too many. Out of the, and I don't know. I mean, out of the 1500 fiction, I would like to see better, I guess better everything.
Can you tell me
essays, and because from the number that I get, I have to tell you, I probably only accept maybe 2 essays out of the 100.
Oh, wow.
So I'd like to have better. I'd like to have more people. And I think what I need to do is have more people understanding what we do, read essays in the Hudson Review. Not that they have to copy them, but to get a sense of the range and the openness we have to certain things. But it can't be a personal essay that's so private that it has really nothing to do with the world, you know? Yeah. But, when I think about it, we've published things about families, about all kinds of things, but it has some kind of a universal feeling to it, that is something that applies to many people, not just to some particular incident in their life that changed their life, maybe. Yeah. So, yeah, I can say that right away. Since I'm now reading all the essays, I would love to have some better ones to read,
Is there something, speaking of like better essays, is there something you can identify, maybe there's not, but that takes a work from that B+ to an A+? Is there something that you can tell these writers who are watching this, like, make sure you go back through, tighten the language, strengthen the imagery, or is it this kind of ineffable?
I think it's much more the theme, right?
Yeah, theme.
I think it's much more the theme. What is the point? What is the point?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, imagery is always, it's always good, to write tight, but I just, it has to be the subject. It has to be a subject which has, as I said, a more universal feeling to it. That people can read and when you read things that are wonderful, it changes your life. Yeah. Always. It enhances your life, and you want somebody to read something and think, oh my goodness, I just got so much out of that. And I think that's what I want people to feel. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it can be about, and there's such a range, of what it could be about. I'm just looking here. Well, of course, we only did the this one particularly. I was going to try to get another example. Not the Elgin Marbles as an example. Well, just talking about Molina, he did a major piece. One of these essays was on Velasquez. But when he wrote, and he's just a master, but when he wrote about it, you learned not just about him, you learned about how the court was arranged, how common people, how the slaves were who worked for them. And actually, one of the slaves who worked for that artist and just, kind of peeled the paint and made the canvases and so forth, used to paint at night. And one time when the king was coming in to look at Velasquez's paintings, he put one of his paintings between, and the king picked it. And it kind of made his life. And actually, that artist now has a show at the Met that's just opening. So, so he talked about all the kind of the details. Details are always a wonderful thing to think about. Yeah. People love to know, the sort of inside stories of things. And yeah, in general, though, it would be the theme. And, it's like everything else. You have to read a lot to write. So my suggestion is to get great essays, or just read other essays in the Hudson Review. Will give you an idea. And we always have an essay open online. And just go back to essays, or if you know one of our authors, just go back and see them.
Right. And we have a question, sort of a personal question. Someone wants to know what you're working on now.
What am I working on? Do we have time? Well, my first book, my field is generally architecture, landscape architecture, design in general. And my first book was most of my garden articles that were in the New York Times, just called Of Gardens. And because that's what a publisher came to me to do. But the book that I've just done relates back to my graduate work at Columbia, which was in medieval French. I always find there are a lot of medievalists and classicists who go into publishing in that way. Anyway, there was a figure that I wrote about. It was a literary essay. He was a troubadour. He was the Count of Champagne. But he had a very interesting life. And the short version is that I made an itinerary of his life, which took me through France and Spain, because he eventually became king of a province in Spain called Navarre, and he took a crusade. So my main traveling was France, Navarre, and Israel. And I have followed it to see if he lived between 1201 and 1253, the great Romanesque period. And so I did the travel to see if I still see what he saw in the 13th century. And that's what the book is. The book is a memoir of that experience. So you learn about him, you learn about me, and you learn about a lot about architecture and landscape. And the answer is yes, that it's all there. You can still find the 13th century wherever you go, and especially in the town where the Crusades began, in Acre, or Akka as it's now called, because all of the 13th century buildings, when the Ottoman Empire came in, rather than tear them down, they filled them with sand and built on top of them. And during the 90s, the archaeologists took out all the sand, took down the Ottoman buildings, and now you have the original Crusader buildings in perfect condition because they were protected by the earth, you know. So it's been a very exciting. I traveled like over 20 years. I mean, I couldn't do a Fulbright or something. So I mean, I couldn't leave the office. So my last trip was crossing the Mediterranean, as he would have done, in October 2019, and then I kept thinking, when am I going to have time to write this book? And then the pandemic came, and I divided my life. I worked on the Hudson Review till 2:00 every day, at home with my computer, you know, brought from home from the office to the home, and then I wrote from 2 to 7 every day. And if you do that, you can write a book in 2 years. So now I'm editing it, and I don't even have a publisher. I mean, it's my own project. So anybody want to publish it out there, let me know. So first I'll have to go through what all my writers do. I'll have to find an agent and,
Right.
So, but anyway, it's been tremendous fun doing it. And it was a great use of my French. So, right.
Sounds great.
But that's it. And it's called,
Go ahead. No, tell us what it's called.
No, I mean, there's a mystery in it, because he died in Pamplona, which you probably all know from Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. That was the capital of Navarre. And when he was the king, so he was buried in the cathedral, and his heart was returned to this town in Champagne, which is, in the Champagne area now, and to a little convent. And I had always wondered whether his heart was still there. That was the mystery that got me involved in the book. And his name was Thibaut. So the book is called Thibaut's Heart, A Journey Through France and Time. That's it.
Well, I have one final question, but I think I might know the answer to it already. But this is something that's all editors, which is just what keeps you going, what sustains you, what keeps you in the work.
I can tell you that.
This lit mag.
Well, first, the addiction is that every day there's an adventure. Something comes in every single day that just makes you happy. That's number one. I mean, I tell you, I don't come in expecting or say, what is it going to be today? I just come in to sit down, hit the deadline, go over the manuscripts. I mean, I have the job. But somebody will call, somebody will send something in, somebody will come over to me and say, oh, look what just happened, or look at what just came in. So that's number one. When you have a life like that, you're just happy to have it. And the other thing is, I don't know everything. Every time I read a piece, even these pieces that I reject, I learn something. And it's like being a graduate student the rest of your life. There's
Yeah.
not, so I sit down, I can't tell you how much fun that is. And as I say, even things that are not accepted in the Hudson Review, I'll learn about. I mean, I learned this morning I was raised in Trenton, New Jersey. I just learned this morning the history of a bookshop that was in Princeton. I was a little girl, so I didn't know about it, but it was very interesting to read it. And it was a story of a bookshop, but it wasn't that kind that would be for us. But you accumulate knowledge. And so it's an easy way, excuse me, for not getting stale. You know what I'm saying? It's just life that provides you with that wonderful ingredient, aside, what the reading is and so forth that you do on your own. And I might tell you what, the other thing I did in my pandemic, I can't believe I did it, because I needed to read it. And I read 12 Dickens novels. And that Charles Dickens was my friend at the evening, beside watching the Met Opera online. But you can do your own reading, but I don't know, it's like an easy way of learning so much. And I think I'm really addicted to those two things, the adventure and the learning.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. It's been
wonderful being with you all and seeing you. Right. Thank you so much.